Thank you so much for tuning into Comic-Con at Home. This is The Conversation with Raina and Robin. I'm Raina Telgemeier, and I'm joined by Robin Ha. We're going to talk a little bit about the comics that we do and writing memoir, and then we're going to take some questions from our audience. You ready to go, Robin?
I am good. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is going to be a pleasure. So my name is Robin Ha. I am a Korean-American cartoonist based in Washington, D.C. I'm the author and the illustrator of Almost American Girl, a graphic novel memoir, which came out in January this year. And also Cook Korean, a comic book with recipes, which is a comic book with recipes about Korean food. That came out, I guess, 4 years ago, and it's been on New York Times bestsellers list.
Nothing is better than comics and cooking together, in my opinion. So, do you want to give a brief synopsis of Almost American Girl for our readers?
Sure.
And our watchers and our listeners, because this is video.
Yeah, whoever is going to be watching.
Yeah.
So let me show you the cover of my graphic novel memoir. So this is Almost American Girl. It's a memoir about my experience moving from Korea to Huntsville, Alabama in the mid-90s as a teenager. So I was born in South Korea, and when I was 14, my mom and I went on a vacation to Alabama. And when we got there, she married her friend who lived there, who is also a Korean-American man. And so we never went back, and I had to enroll in the 8th grade American school without speaking any English. So basically it's about my journey as a Korean girl moving here and being thrown into American society.
Woo. It's quite the topic, and it's quite the book as well. So I'll just briefly summarize my newest book, which is called Guts. And this is also a memoir, and it's about how I started experiencing anxiety and phobias and a lot of physical symptoms of those things when I was a child. So I was about 9 years old when I started having panic attacks. And I have already delved into other aspects of my teen and tween years in my memoirs, but I had never really talked about some of the inside parts and some of the reasons why I am the way I am and some of the decisions that I've made and kind of what led me there. So I figured it was just time to really talk about one of the hardest things I've ever had to deal with, which is fear. So I wrote it. It was scary to write, but it was actually really cathartic to do so. So now I get to have lots of conversations with people about anxiety, which is something I think we all share in some ways and have in common.
I love that book. I mean, I didn't even know there was a name for a fear of vomit.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Me too.
Really? Oh man. So it's a pretty common fear. Yeah, it's called emetophobia, and the fear of throwing up or being sick is something I've dealt with since I was 9 years old. Yeah, but that's not what the story ends up really being about. It's more about courage and facing the things that upset you, which I think you dealt with some in your book as well. There is a scene in your book where you talk about having frequent stomach aches as a child, and your doctor couldn't figure out why.
Yeah, I mean, in Korea, it's not really talked about, which is a problem, you know? So even if you do have a symptom, like physical symptom that is clearly from some kind of anxiety or some psychological reason, like not many people think about like bringing their child to, or even adult, to a psychologist. So, I mean, I think it's getting better now, but, you know, back in the days when I was a teenager, it just was, yeah.
Yeah, I was really lucky that my parents were able to bring me to a therapist when I was 10. I know that not every kid had that experience, and it wasn't easy, but it was helpful. But I didn't see a therapist then again between age 11 and age 37. So it was a lot of years in my life. Those are also the years I became a cartoonist. So maybe that was my way of dealing with it. But no, I think things are starting to get better now. And we're just more aware of the kinds of things that kids are facing. And I'm really grateful that we now can have a conversation about it out in the open, and it's not stigmatized the way that it used to be.
And I think it's because of books like yours that kind of brings more light into and normalizing this kind of, illnesses, basically, that it's being treated with such taboo for no good reason in the past. Yeah. How about we talk about what it's like to be writing a memoir?
Sure. I mean, I've been doing that now for over 10 years, and it's not always easy to visit your past and try and come up with the best way to make it into a story that other people are going to read. And in my case, I'm often trying to make the work funny. So it's like, how do you tap into those memories and find the humor in them? But yeah, I mean, with Guts, it was hard. I didn't enjoy the process, but I knew that I was going to feel a lot better afterwards. And I also have to take into consideration that I'm writing about real people and real experiences that I've had that they've shared. And sometimes their memories are not the same as mine. Like sometimes my father will read my comics and he's like, this isn't how it happened. And I'm like, well, you were in your 40s when that happened and I was 8. So of course your memory is a little bit clearer and it's a little bit more defined and you remember like some of the extenuating circumstances, where I just remember how I felt when I was dealing with that thing. So my memories, in order to translate them onto the page, I do have to use some creative license, and I have to decide, how to set up conversations and how to
writing the memoir, not your dad's.
Exactly. But, I also want to make sure that the kernel of truth is there. And I do often ask people questions about their memories, and I had my mom read the script for Guts, for example, just to see if she had any perspective to offer. And then, of course, I work with my editor, who will tell me if something is confusing or if there seems to be a big chunk of the story that doesn't jive with the rest of it. And so it's not exactly reshaping your memories, but it is crafting them into something for the reader to experience. What about you?
I mean, I definitely agree with everything you said. I mean, I think, I grew up reading mainly fantasy and science fiction comics that are like completely not like based in reality at all. So it's quite weird to consider myself as a cartoonist who draws like mainly non-fictional stuff so far. When I first started writing memoir, I was like, at least I know what happens and like how it's going to end. So it's like, it will be easier than like writing a fictional story, but it was not any easier in my opinion, because like you have a pretty big responsibility to tell the story as truthfully as possible, and also like you're talking about real people with real lives, so you want to do justice to your the people involved in the story too. So there's a lot of anxiety that happened while I was writing Almost American Girl, and especially my mother was completely against being in my book.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so she was very upset when I told her, like, hey, I'm going to be doing this memoir and you're going to be, like, basically one of the main characters. And she was like, you can't do that. You got to take me out. And I'm like, I can't write this story in 1 minute. Like, you were my parent. And I was a minor. So, like, most of the things that I talk about in the book happened because of her decision to come here.
Right.
So it took me a long time to convince my mom to make sure that she was okay with it and earn her trust to, like tell her like, this is going to be a book that's very important to me, but also like, I respect you and I want you to be okay with it. So I promised her, once I'm done with writing part, the layout part of the book, I'm going to give her the manuscript so she can read it. And if she like absolutely hates it, then I'm going to be, just axing the project. Like, it's not worth, making her upset. She's my mom,
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So I gave her the manuscript, and like that, like 2-3 days of her reading the book was like one of the most time of writing this book. But thank God she loved it, and she only gave me like maybe a couple of factual edits, but other than that, she was 100% cool with it. So
wow.
If you want to write a memoir, you have to think about all these things. It's not just the book, you have to think about.
Do you guys talk about it now that it's done, or is it just like, that's out of the way, we're never going to mention it again?
I think she still feels a little self-conscious about being book. So like, I mean, it's not a subject that we talk about. Like when we sit down and eat food together, it's not like, hey, so like, let's go talk about your book. So it's the first couple of times when I had a book signing in DC, she came and, during the, Q&A and stuff like that, I kind of, directed some of the questions from the audience to my mom, and she was very embarrassed. I mean,
Aww.
she wasn't like feeling embarrassed in a bad way. She was just like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I did not expect the spotlight on me, Yeah, so I think she kind of enjoyed, people telling her like how much like her action and her bravery meant to them.
That's amazing. That's like such a good outcome for that, all the anxiety that you had to go through in order to put it out there.
Right. Yeah.
That's great. You mentioned just briefly that you read mostly fantasy while you were growing up. Can you tell me what some of your biggest influences were?
Yeah, so I grew up in Korea, so all the books I read were written and drawn by Korean authors or Japanese authors. So I read a lot of mangas also. So one of my favorite cartoonists in Korea, her name is Shin Il-suk. I don't know if her books ever got translated into English, but she basically wrote fantasy, like grand, epic fantasy, like Lord of the Rings kind of style, So they're like magic and fairies and elves, and like I love that stuff. And I guess Japanese author that I love is I mean there are so many. Like I loved Clamp and all the like the 80s and 90s like big names, but my very very favorite is Ikeda Ryoko, and she is known for the Rose of Versailles. I think
yeah.
70s. So it's like a historical fiction about French Revolution and like Marie Antoinette and all the like wigs and costumes.
Yeah,
I loved it. I still
Were you reading them translated into Korean?
Yeah.
Okay.
So when I first read it, I think I was like around 8 years old, and I didn't know that it was Japanese. So a lot of the books that came over, like I just didn't have a concept of like anybody else but Koreans living on the earth. So when I was watching TV, that's like, like 90210 or like, Friends or whatever, like dubbed in Korean, I thought Korean. I was like, oh, these like American people speak like perfect Korean. And I thought that was like this normal thing.
Wow. Was the dub that good that it looked like they were actually speaking?
Yeah, I mean, like when you're little, you don't really
right.
pay attention to like how their mouth matches. So I just thought that everybody in the world spoke Korean.
I think everybody in the world should speak Korean. It's a really cool language. That's awesome. I read just a tiny bit of manga when I was growing up because so little had been translated by the time I started reading comics. And Barefoot Gen was my first manga.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is kind of an intense one to begin with. But my dad had heard about it. It had just been translated into English. And he knew that I was getting into newspaper comics. And so I was reading like Calvin and Hobbes and For Better or For Worse and Peanuts. And he was like, here's a comic book that you might be interested in reading. But, I was 10 when he handed me that book. And it opened up my mind in a way that I guess I have to thank him for, because it made me in a lot of ways into the person that I became. But I couldn't just like walk into class the next day and be like, hey, did you guys read the latest volume of Barefoot Gen? Because it was hard to get a hold of. It wasn't really intended for, American children to read.
Right. Yeah.
It's a book about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. But it really does focus on like the family and the story and their relationships and the hardships that they had to go through. So, I remember being a kid and thinking like, I hope nothing like this ever happens in my lifetime.
Yeah.
But what an amazing thing to be able to take something so horrifying and turn it into a story and turn it into something that another person could read 40 years later and feel affected by. Yeah. So I think
that's the beauty of comics. You can turn something very, very ugly and very hurtful and painful into something actually beautiful and digesting, easily, understood by all kinds of people, and like, I think that's why I wanted to be a cartoonist,
Yeah. Me too.
So, do you want to draw something with me?
We should, yeah, let's draw something together. What do you want to draw, Robin?
So how about we draw something interesting that happened to us during self-isolation?
Sounds good.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, can you guys see this? So this is what happened when I first tried Zoom. So I'm like really bad with technology. Like I'm worse than some of the grandmas I know. So I couldn't trust that like people could hear me through the computer. So I would like shout at people. And one time we were watching some scary movie and we were having like a, Zoom movie night with a few friends of mine. And every time I spoke, I think I had like a really bad internet connection. Like my voice would get distorted on their end. And they're like, oh my God, you sound like the devil. Yeah.
Oh man. All right. I will do some drawing as well. And
during pandemic, I started out by baking bread on a pretty regular basis, but I live alone. One person can only eat so much bread. So that has now moved on to me making other things. And one of the best things that I've learned to make is pizza. And I'm using sometimes my sourdough starter for that. Sometimes I'm just baking it with yeast from scratch. But I've never really tried making pizza before this, and I love eating pizza, so delicious.
so we asked our readers for some questions on Instagram and Twitter, and we are going to read them now and do our best to answer them for you. So the first question is from Maddie, who's 13 years old. And Maddie wants to know, I was wondering, if you weren't an author, what would your job be?
I think I would have been a fine artist, painter mostly. So like when I was little, like, I, went to art school after school, and I went to a fine art school as a, in college. So like I've always been a painter first, I guess. And that's how I learned to draw anything by using, like fine art mediums like oil and acrylic and watercolor. So that's what I still love to do. Like whenever I have free time, like I will make a painting. So yeah, that's what I would be doing.
That
How
makes
about you?
sense. Your work is so painterly that's like perfect to hear. I think that the thing I weirdly enjoy the most is planning stuff. And that's something that I've had to change my entire personality because of the pandemic, is that I'm used to like planning the next trip that I'm going to go on, and when's my next tour starting, and which city am I going to be in, and which days, and which restaurant am I going to eat at. And so like all of the planning that I used to do for fun is now not a part of my life. And I feel like, what am I supposed to do with myself? So I think I might be a publicist, because I love making calendars. I love spreadsheets. I love schedules. I love like figuring out how long it's going to take to drive from point A to point B, and what, restaurants are along the way. So yeah, I think I'd like to be a publicist in another life.
I think you'd be very successful at it. Yeah. I was just like, when's the last time I ever planned for a trip? Like, I can't remember. And I also love to travel. So it's like, it's been a huge part of my life that I don't even know when it will come back.
Yeah, I know it's strange, but I'm trying to embrace just being here, being where I am, and enjoying that a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I love staying at home. Like, I'm such a homebody anyways. Awesome. So the next question from the audience is from Brisa, age 9. How were you able to get over your fear of vomit? I'm afraid of it too. Me too.
That's a question. So again, the clinical term for the fear of vomit is emetophobia. And so I am an emetophobe, and I've been one since I was a kid. And I didn't learn that term until I was in my early 30s. And once I discovered that term, I realized that there were ways that you could go about trying to become better. I don't want to say fix it or solve it, because I don't think you can really fix or solve a fear that's so deeply rooted in you. Yeah. But what I ended up doing was I went to a therapist who specialized in treating phobias. And I did something called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short. And what they do is they really investigate the fear and then teach you coping techniques. So I learned a lot about breathing and about how to ground myself and how to engage my mind in other ways when I felt the panic descending. And so one of the techniques that was used, and that's terrifying to think about, is called exposure therapy. And that means that you gradually expose yourself to the thing that you're afraid of. So my therapist did not like make me throw up in his office. That's not what it was about. It was about trying to do things like say the word out loud or see the word written on a piece of paper. It got to the point where I was looking at photographs and like listening to audio clips.
Oh no.
I know, it's so stressful to think about, but it's amazing that if you can learn to address the anxiety in a safe space and learn to get closer to your fear very gradually, very, very gradually over the course of time. You really have to trust the person that you're working with. Little by little, your anxiety levels start to go down. And these are techniques that you learn that you can then bring into other parts of your life. And so I've just learned to cope with it, and I've learned to live with it, and I've learned to accept it. And I think for me, just being able to talk about it is really helpful. I would not have been able to write the book Guts if it weren't for this therapy that I have done. And I understand that not everybody has access to this type of therapy or, this amount of time and these resources, but the internet is really useful. So if you look up things like mindfulness breathing and grounding techniques, there are videos on YouTube that talk about it. And there's a lot of resources available. So that's how I have spent the last 30 years of my life, is learning to get a little bit better. We'll have to record an extra hour of content about this topic specifically, because I could talk all day about it. But instead, I will ask a question that came in from Instagram from Fox, who's 13, who asks, in your books, you face a lot of bullying. What advice would you give folks going through similar things now?
That's a great question. And I think the most important thing to remember is that it's the bully that has a problem, not you.
Mm.
So don't internalize whatever the bully is saying to you or doing to you, and never think of it as like it's your fault, you know? And also you it's something you shouldn't be ashamed of. It's really like, I think when I was a kid and when I was getting bullied, I internalized that a lot, and I thought it was like, oh, you know, like, yeah, they have a reason to call me this, or they have reason to be mean to me, but it's definitely not true. um, and you I think you need to go out and make an ally. You know, don't try to go through this alone. And so you can talk to your teacher about it, your parents about it, or your friends about it. And like, the more you talk about it and the more you seek ally, the better and the quicker you will, you know, get over that.
I'm going to echo your sentiment, which is just to find somebody that you can trust,
Yeah.
whether they're your age, whether they're older than you, just a safe place that you can talk about it. Because having somebody on your side to remind you of the things that you just said, Robin, like, it's not your fault and you haven't done anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with you. The problem is with the bully, and maybe together we can figure out a solution, whether that's all sitting down together and having a conversation, whether that's calling in your principal to, like, you know, mediate a little bit, or there's so many different ways, and there's so many different people, and there's so many kinds of bullying. And I think one of the hardest is when the bullies are your friends.
Yeah.
And they're people that you've known for a long time. And there's just this way that even friends sometimes antagonize one another that can just so delicately, like, turn from it's not that big of a deal to it's a huge deal. Yeah. So that's where having somebody that you can really trust. I hope everybody can find that person.
If that happens, you know, like with your friends, like, also you're afraid of losing your friends too.
Yeah.
Like, you know that these people are not good for you and they make
you,
but like, without them you feel like you're gonna be lonely, like you don't have friends. But like, you know, there's millions of people out there. So these are not gonna be your friends forever, trust me. Like, whoever your friends are in your, you know, middle school, elementary school, like, maybe some of them can be your friends as an adult, but most of the people are gonna be replaced by somebody better, somebody, you know, as you grow older and evolve into some, you know, a new person basically. So don't worry too much about keeping these people as your friend, because, you know, most likely they're not really your friends.
It might be better to be alone because you can be your own friend.
And you will make new friends.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so we have another question that came in from Twitter from Mia, who's 12. What made you have the passion to start writing?
I guess it's by reading comics.
Hey!
When I was young, like, you know, 5 years old, 6 years old, like, I started reading comics first. So before I read like books, I started reading comics. Thanks to my mom, who was also a very big comics reader. So like, because I loved reading comics so much, like, I wanted to grow up and become a cartoonist. So that's how I started to, like, you know, write down my ideas. Like, when I grow up, I want to write this kind of, you know, comic and stuff. So
I was a big diary writer when I was a kid, and I was also an artist. So it was kind of like, at some point after I started reading comics, much like you, I realized I could just sort of put those two interests together. So I started making my first journal comics when I was like 11 years old. And every day after school, I would write comics about my day. And I never showed them to anybody. But, you know, I was like, this is just what I have to do to get all this stuff off my chest. And sometimes people would ask, like, oh, do you want to be a writer when you grow up? And I was like, no, because I don't have any ideas. So you thought you were going to be a fantasy writer because, and then you ended up writing more personal comics and memoir. I thought that just wasn't even an option. I was like, wait, this isn't a job. This is not something I can make a career out of. So I don't know. I wish I had more access to memoir and to personal stories and personal comics when I was growing up. The closest thing was probably For Better or For Worse, which was a comic strip that ran in the newspaper for 30 years, and it felt like reading a journal. It felt like reading a diary about a family, and they all grew up over the course of those 30 years, so it was like, it was just the day in the life of the Pattersons, and so seeing the ins and outs and the ups and downs was so appealing to me. So, I don't know, I figured it out eventually, but it took some time to get there.
Show your comics that you wrote when you were like 11 years old?
I mean, they're not very good.
Forever, nobody's gonna.
But I think them not being good is kind of important. I think they don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be for show. They don't have to be for anybody but yourself because you enjoy doing it. Yeah. And I loved the feeling of putting words and pictures together on the page. I just did. And I did it as a hobby. I would have continued to do it even if it wasn't my job. Right. If I ended up as a, publicist instead. But I feel really lucky that I get to do this every day and I get to tell stories.
So Josie, age 13, asked, do you envision your drawing first or the words first when you write graphic novels?
Ooh, which comes first, the words or the pictures? For me, they actually come together. Mm-hmm. So when I have an idea in my head, it is visual and I can hear the characters talking. Mm-hmm. So the way for me to transcribe that is to just grab a piece of paper, draw a box, and then start scribbling in the box what the comic is going to look like. And I use stick figures. I don't render each drawing lovingly and carefully. I just scribble the words that they're saying and then draw the word balloon around it, pointing at their mouths, and then the expression on their face, and then whatever they're reacting to. So that's called thumbnailing.
Yeah.
And I write that way. I write entire manuscripts that way. My editor edits from that. And if I try to start with a script, if I just sit down with my computer and think about typing what characters are saying, it doesn't come naturally to me. I have to draw their little head with their little eyes and their mouth before they will speak to me. And the same thing happens if I just try to draw pictures. If I sketch, I'm actually not great at keeping a sketchbook. Some people are great at it, but I am not, because they're not acting. They're not doing the thing. They're not talking yet. I need them together. So yeah, I don't start with one or the other. I start with both. What about you?
I'm the same way. So when I think of a story, they come to me like a movie, like I'm watching a movie or like a dream. So it's basically like a scene with actual characters. They're acting in my head, So I'll basically write like you did thumbnail or basically a screen, how do you call it, storyboarding,
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't really make it into a comic strip first. I'll basically draw a index card size of basically what's happening as a scene. So both picture and word, very, very rough stick figures. And that was okay to do so far. But now I'm working on a new book that's a fiction book and it's complete fantasy set in century. So I'm going back to my childhood dream of
I'm so excited.
Yeah. And since this is my first fictional comic book that I'm gonna write, I actually had to transcribe whatever that I envisioned in my head as a text first, because that's slightly easier to edit and show to other people. Because my sketches are super rough, nobody can see what's going on other than me. So I had to basically write it very simply, this happens and that happens and that happens, kind of like that. So it's not a full-on comic script, but I had to write as a synopsis in a Word doc.
I'm so excited to read that.
Yeah, I'm excited to draw it. I can't wait to draw it.
Do you have, is this an announcement yet, or can you talk about it, or is it just far in the future?
Well, I can show you a few drawings right here.
Yes, please.
It's one of the character I was doing. So when I come up with stories, I usually do character design first as I'm writing or doing thumbnails, just to kind of get it concrete vision of them. So this is one of their character. So it's very different in style from my previous books. So it's gonna be drama and action. There's gonna be some shapeshifters and murder. It's gonna be cool.
This is so cool. I wish I had a preview to show of the next thing that I'm working on, but that is not allowed to talk about it yet, all in secrecy. But in time, I will talk about the next project that I'm going to be releasing.
No more.
So then let's do one final question from Shendrima. I hope I'm saying that correctly, who asks, I hope to publish my own graphic novel someday. What suggestions do you have?
I think I think you need to first learn to finish your comics. So a lot of young cartoonists, including myself, when I was just starting out, I had this idea for like epic fantasy 500-page long comics as my first graphic novel. And it's fun to think about these things and fun to like maybe draw the first 20 pages of it, but it's a very different thing once you have to actually finish it, you know. So a lot of people don't realize like how much time and energy and like how much nights you're gonna be spending just like banging your head against your drawing board. So I think I highly recommend first starting small. So like don't start with 500-page book, maybe start with like 20-page book and then finish it, and that's something you can actually show to people, you know. So that is my advice.
Robin, you keep taking the words right out of my mouth. I always say that. Start small. If you've got two characters, draw a short scene that's 2 pages long of the two of them having a conversation or having a small adventure together or just solving a problem. And then do another 2-page story, do a 5-page story, do a 20-page story. And maybe that turns into a collection of short stories about the world that you're developing. Maybe it's just something you post on a website somewhere, but either way, you're building your chops, you are getting practice, and you're seeing if it appeals to you. And if you don't have the patience for comics, which do take a lot of time, maybe this is a good time to find that out. And you can always, you know, be a writer or an artist without combining the two interests. You can always collaborate with somebody else. There are so many ways to tell stories. That I'm the type of kid that loved comics so much. I knew I had to make them. But, you know, it's just one piece of a giant web of ways to tell stories. And we have so many options now. So yeah, start small. Be kind to yourself. If you're like, I don't know how to start, just start on page 1, do some sketches, put some word balloons in the characters' mouths. I don't know.
The danger of doing something so long when you're a young author is that your style might change in the midway.
That's true.
Your personal taste in stories might change too. So you're stuck with a long project that's going to take you like 4 years to finish, and then in the middle of it you realize, oh, I don't really like the story, or like, oh, I don't like to draw like this anymore. You know, so that's something to consider.
For sure. And I think reading lots of comics is important too. Different kinds, different styles, different genres, different stories. We're so lucky right now that there's so many amazing comics and graphic novels out there. So actually, let's talk about bookstores and where we like to buy comics and where we go to get recommendations and stuff. Do you have some comic stores or bookstores that you want to give a shout out to?
Sure. So I live in Washington, D.C., and there is a small independent bookstore called the Loyalty Bookstore in Petworth, and it's owned by a queer Black lady, and she does awesome stuff for the community. She has a lot of really great book signings and community events, so I highly recommend that place. And a comic book store that I really like to promote is Big Planet Comics. It's one of the oldest comic book store in DC, and like I'm a good friends with the owner, and they always have a really cool events going on, and like their stuff is great. Like they curate really good indie comics and mainstream superhero comics too. So if you're ever in DC, I highly recommend going to these two bookstores.
So I'd love to recommend Brain Lair Books in South Bend, Indiana. They're a Black-owned independent bookstore, and they have a fantastic graphic novels list on their website. So if you're looking for some more recommended reads for YA and middle grade, go to Brain Lair's website and check them out. They ship, so if you want to order online, you can. And I'm also going to give a shout out to my local independent, Green Apple Books in San Francisco, California. The store has been around since before I was born, and I've been going there since I was a teenager. I used to go there with my dad. They have a great comic section and a great kids section, so they also ship, and they just opened up again for in-person business. So support some of the stores that we've suggested, support your local independent bookstore, buy books.
Awesome.
So thank you so much, Robin, for joining me. This has been so much fun.
Thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I
You're
wish
welcome.
this in person, but here we are.
Next time, Comic-Con hopefully will be in person, but we've really enjoyed doing Comic-Con at home. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Everyone.
Bye.
Bye.